July 1995, in the mountains of Bosnia, thousands of frightened civilians crowded beneath the flag of the United Nations they believed they would save the world had promised they would be, but within days fathers disappeared, families were torn apart, and entire groups of men and boys vanished into forests and warehouses from which almost none would return. This was not a hidden massacre. The world saw the warnings, the world heard the desperate calls for help, and still a town-filled night we travel back to the final days of Srebrenica, a small mining town that became the site of Europe's worst mass killing since World War II. During the Bosnian War, a story of refugees trapped inside a United Nations safe zone, of peacekeepers overwhelmed by impossible choices, of families destroyed in front of the cameras of the modern world, and of how more than 8,000 people disappeared while the international community hesitated. This is not only the story of a massacre, it is the story of promises that filled of silence that cost lives, and of the haunting question that still echoes across Bosnia decades later: how could this happen while the world was watching? Welcome to History Ledger. Tonight we uncover the story of Srebrenica, the town the world failed. The mountains of eastern Bosnia were quiet, that winter not peaceful, just quiet in the way abandoned places become quiet. After too much fear has passed through them, drifted above burned village, gas roads disappeared beneath snow and mood. Families walked through forests, carrying blankets, cooking pots, and whatever remained of their lives. By 1992, the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina was collapsing into war. The old nation of Yugoslavia was breaking apart. Borders changed overnight. Who had once shared streets, schools, and weddings suddenly found themselves divided by ethnicity, politics, and armed militia. Across Bosnia, civilians became trapped in the middle of something far larger than themselves. In the east, near the Serbian border, small Muslim Bosniak villages were attacked, one after another. Homes were burned, prisoners fled deeper into the mountains, searching for safety. Many of them ended up in a small mining town called Srebrenica. Before the war, Srebrenica had been ordinary. Children played football in its streets, miners worked in nearby hills rich with silver ore, families drank coffee in crowded cafes, while buses carried workers through the valley roads. But by 1993, the town had transformed into a refugee enclave, overflowing with desperation. Population exploded as terrified civilians poured in from destroyed villages surrounding the region. Food became scarce. Electricity often vanished for days. Apartments designed for one family now held 10 or 15 people, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on cold concrete floors. Disappeared first, then fuel, then hope. Surrounding the enclave on nearly every side were Bosnian Serb forces tightening their grip around the town. Mortar struck crowded street. Snipers watched the roads. Humanitarian aid convoys were blocked or turned away before reaching the starving population. Some people survived on weeds, thin soup, and scraps of flour collected from abandoned storage buildings. Simply waited for help, waited for the world to notice the images coming out of Bosnia shocked international audiences. Prisoners, destroyed villages, civilians trapped behind front lines under growing pressure. The United Nations made a promise. In April 1993, the UN officially declared Srebrenica a safe area. The civilians trapped inside the enclave, those words sounded like salvation, safer, area protection, security. The blue helmets of UN peacekeepers soon arrived in the town under a Dutch battalion that became known as Dutch Bath. Armored vehicles rolled through muddy roads while exhausted civilians watched from shattered apartment windows. For many refugees, the arrival of the UN meant the nightmare might finally end. Waved at the soldiers' families gathered near UN compounds, believing the outside world had finally stepped in. But behind the appearance of protection, the reality was peacekeepers were lightly armed. They were too few in number. Supplies were limited. Fuel shortages crippled movement on deck. The UN mandate itself was painfully unclear. Soldiers stationed there were expected to keep peace in a place where peace no longer exists. Months passed. Conditions inside Srebrenica continued to deteriorate. Starvation spread quietly. Disease moved through overcrowded shelters. Outside the enclave, Bosnian Serb forces continued watching, waiting, tightening the noose around the town. Yet, despite everything, many civilians still believed one thing: the United Nations would never allow Srebrenica to fall, because if a UN safe zone could be destroyed in front of the world, then nowhere was truly safe anymore. And in the summer of 1995, That belief was about to be tested because beyond the forests surrounding Srebrenica, troops, artillery, and armored vehicles were already moving into position. The attack had begun long before the town realized it, and the world was about to witness one of the darkest chapters in modern European history. By July 1995, the people of Srebrenica had been surrounded for years. The enclave was exhausted. Food convoys, rarely arrived medicines were almost gone. Families lived inside abandoned factories, schools, and broken apartment blocks where windows had long since been shattered by shellfire. But despite the hunger and fear, many still believed the town would survive. After all, this was a United Nations safe zone. The blue helmets were still there. The UN flag still flew above the base at Potok. Thousands of civilians trapped inside the valley. That flag meant the world was watching. Then, in early July, the shelling intensified. Serb forces began pushing closer toward the enclave's southern edge. Villages fell one after another. Observation posts staffed by Dutch peacekeepers were overrun or abandoned as armed units advanced through the hills inside. The town panic spread quickly. Families packed what little they owned into bags and blankets. Rumors moved through crowded streets faster than official information. Some said NATO airstrikes were coming. Others said the United Nations had lost control entirely. Meanwhile, Bosnian Serb commander Ratko Mladić prepared for the final assault. Forces moved methodically toward the enclave, while UN commanders desperately requested and again requests were delayed. Meetings dragged on. Permissions stalled between military chains of command and international political leaders far from Bosnia's front lines. Hours passed. Then, more hours inside Srebrenica. Civilians waited for planes that never came on. July 11, 1995, the town collapsed. Serb forces entered Srebrenica almost without resistance. Cameras followed Mladic as he walked through empty streets, surrounded by soldiers. He smiled for television crews. He handed candy to frightened children. In one of the most chilling moments captured during the war, he declared that the time had come to take revenge against the Muslims. By then, thousands of terrified civilians were already fleeing north toward the UN base at Potok. Roads became rivers of human desperation. Women carried babies through the heat. Old men collapsed beside the roadside. Children cried for parents lost somewhere in the chaos behind them. By nightfall, nearly 25,000 people crowded around the Dutch UN compound. There was almost no food, almost no water. The heat inside the factory buildings became suffocating. People fainted where they stood outside the gates. Armed soldiers moved through the crowds while panic spread in waves. At the same time, another group made a different choice. Around 10 to 15,000 Bosniak men and boys gathered in the forests, attempting to escape through Serbian lines toward Bosnian government territory. Near Tuslave called it the Kalamna. Desperate march through mountains and minefields. Many believed the forests offered a better chance of survival than surrender, but the woods soon became killing grounds. Were shelled from the hillsmen, were ambushed, captured, or separated in the darkness. Some surrendered after promises of safety. Others kept walking for days without food or water, surrounded by gunfire echoing through the trees. Back in Portozari, the separations began. Women and small children were loaded onto buses. Men and teenage boys were pulled aside for questionings. Some tried hiding among families, clung to their mothers or wives, refusing to let go. Dutch peacekeepers watched as terrified civilians were taken away. Many soldiers later described feelings of helplessness, confusion, and horror at what unfolded around them. But by then, control of the enclave was gone. The buses rolled out of Potozari, carrying thousands of women and children away from Srebrenica. Behind them remained fathers, brothers, sons, and husbands who would never return. Over the following days, execution sites appeared across Eastern Bosnia. Schools, warehouses, fields, farm buildings, hidden between forests and dirt roads. Thousands of prisoners were murdered systematically and buried in mass graves. And while the killings continued, the world still struggled to understand what was happening inside the mountains of Bosnia. The time the truth became impossible to hide, an entire community had already disappeared. When the killing ended, the forests around eastern Bosnia fell silent. Agen roads, emptied villages stood abandoned, and across the hills surrounding Srebrenica, Thousands of people were simply gone for surviving families. The waiting began almost immediately. Women, who had been forced onto buses at Podozari, searched refugee centers for husbands, fathers, and sons who never arrived as believed the men had escaped through the forest, held on to rumors that prisoners were still alive somewhere in Serbia. Bosnia, this turned into weeks, became months, but the missing never returned. Instead, evidence slowly began surfacing from the earth itself. Investigators, journalists, and international observers started hearing reports of mass graves hidden across remote valleys and forests. Fresh soil appeared beside isolated roads. Bulldozers had moved through villages at night. Witnesses spoke quietly about executions in warehouses, schools, and farm fields, and as investigators uncovered grave after grave, the scale of what happened became impossible to deny. Thousands of bodies had been buried in secret, then, in many cases, dug up again. Bosnian Serb forces attempted to hide the crime by moving remains into secondary graves scattered across the countryside, tore bodies apart in the process, leaving families to search for fragments of loved ones buried miles apart from each other. Dead had been erased so completely that many families would spend decades waiting to bury even a single bone after. War forensic teams arrived from across the world. Using DNA technology, scientists began one of the largest human identification efforts in modern history. Recovered fragment, Matade Jobone Wache, piece of clothing, a wedding ring, found beneath layers of mud and roots inside forensic laboratories. Thousands of white body bags lined warehouse floors while investigators worked slowly through evidence collected from mass graves. Many mothers, the smallest discovery meant everything. Placed to mourn as investigations continued, international courts began assembling cases against military and political leaders connected to the massacre. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia gathered survivor testimony, military documents, intercepted communications, and video evidence from July 1995. Witnesses described executions that lasted through the night. Prisoners lined up beside fields, gunfire echoing through warehouses, arriving before the bodies had even cooled. Years later, commanders, including Ratko Mladić, were convicted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Courts formally recognized the killings at Srebrenica as genocide, the worst mass murder in Europe since World War II, but legal judgments could never fully answer the deeper question left behind by Srebrenica. How could this happen in a United Nations safe zone? The massacre forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about international peacekeeping, political hesitation, and the limits of global promises made during war for survivors. However, history was never abstracted. Lived inside empty chairs at family tables, inside photographs carried 4 decades inside, names still read aloud every July. Today, Memorial Cemetery in Podozari. Thousands of white gravestones stretch across the valley beneath the same mountains that once echoed with artillery fire and terrified refugees. Your newly identified victims are buried there even now, decades later. Families continue finding remains from graves hidden deep beneath forests and fields. The story of Srebrenica did not end in July 1995. It survives in memory and testimony, in silence, and in the warning it leaves behind. Because Srebrenica was not hidden from the world saw the refugees. The world heard the warnings. The world knew civilians were trapped inside that valley, and still the town fell. That may be the most terrifying part of all. Today, the forests around Srebrenica are quiet once again. Children walk roads that were once crowded with refugees. Grass grows over execution sites hidden beneath the hills, and every July, families still bury newly identified victims from graves uncovered decades after the massacre, because even now the dead are still being found. The story of Srebrenica massacre remains one of the darkest warnings in modern history, not only because of the violence itself, but because the victims believed the world would protect them, and the world failed. If this story moved you, consider sharing it, because history survives only when people are willing to remember it. And if you want more deeply researched historical documentaries told with cinematic storytelling and historical accuracy, subscribe to A History Ledger and join us for the next journey into the forgotten moments of human history. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most dangerous tragedies in history are often the ones the world believed could never happen again.